A homeless, freezing alien woman knocked on 17 doors. The 18th was human, and he let her in. Sierra hadn't felt her fingers in hours. They were just there, numb and rigid inside frost-stiff gloves, pressed against a world that no longer wanted her. The wind in Sector 9K didn't howl. It scraped. It dragged metal banners across ruined railings and whispered through shattered vents like a voice too tired to scream. Each gust cut deeper than the last, slicing past the thin layers she had sewn and re-sewn across too many cold nights. Her breath came in broken clouds, freezing on her lips as soon as it left her. There was no sky above her anymore, just a web of rusted piping, tangled power lines, and failing neon signs stuttering in and out of life. Once this sector had held schools, apartments, clinics. But that was before the directorate redrew the borderlines, before they lifted the city skyward and left the ground to rot. Now there was only silence and doors. She had knocked on 16 so far. Not one had opened. The 17th stood at the end of a narrow alley, its surface pitted and streaked with soot. She hesitated. Her legs were trembling beneath her, not from fear. She no longer had the strength for fear, but because the cold was winning. Still, she raised a hand. The knock was barely audible. A pause. Then from inside a voice. Male, harsh, close. No aliens. The words hit harder than the wind. She staggered back a step, knees buckling. The snow didn't even cushion the fall, just swallowed her in silence. Her vision dimmed. She tried to breathe, but the air sliced down her throat like glass. No aliens, not no visitors, not go away. The word had weight. It always did when they said it. Like she wasn't someone. Just a mistake that walked and breathed and needed too much. She'd heard it before. At border camps and transit stations, behind steel fences with drones that hovered just a second too long. Her species didn't even have a name here. Not one they were allowed to speak aloud. She had blue skin and white hair. That was enough to mark her, enough to be refused. Her forehead touched the snow. She closed her eyes. A memory surfaced. Uninvited, warm, cruel. Her sister back on the mountain plain of Viora, combing her hair before morning prayer. "Your scalp burns when it's angry with you," she'd teased, tugging gently at the tangled strands. "Be kind to it and it'll stop." That was the last time anyone had touched her with kindness. Sierra tried to move. Her arms felt like metal, her legs, stone. Somewhere far away, something inside her whispered, "Get up!" But the rest of her was sinking. This is where it ends, she thought. Not on a battlefield, not with defiance or pride. Just here, alone in a dead street, frozen like the others. One more statistic, but then, light. She didn't know why she opened her eyes, only that she did. Farther down the alley, through a curtain of falling snow, one door glowed. Not bright, not beckoning, but warm. Orange light filtered through narrow slats, diffused like heat through breath on glass. It was out of place, alive in a place that had long since stopped pretending to be. Her body shifted, one movement, then another. She crawled at first, too weak to stand. Her knees dragged through slush. Her hands scraped concrete. Pain returned with the motion, sharp and ragged, reminding her she was still alive. She clung to it. When she reached the door, she couldn't speak. Her lips cracked apart with the attempt, but she managed to lift her hand once more. She knocked. Inside, Gideon Strake didn't react at first. He was deep beneath the floorboards, knee-deep in copper wiring and scorched insulation foam, rerouting power through a junction that was older than he was. The heating coil was acting up again. Another flare-up and the entire boiler would blow. He didn't have another backup. The knock came again. He froze. No one knocked here. Not in 9K. Not unless they were desperate or stupid, or both. He waited. 1 second. 2. Another knock. Fainter. He moved fast now, stripping off the arc gloves and climbing the ladder up into the main level of the shelter. The hallway was dim. He flicked the overhead switch. Nothing. The backup strips had gone cold. At the door, he listened. No voices, no weapons charging, no threats. He unlatched the first bolt, then the second. He opened the door, and for a moment time staggered. She was on her knees, her frame too still, her arms hanging slack. The snow was gathering in her hair, long, silver-white strands that caught the orange furnace light like threads of starlight. Her skin, pale blue and bruised around the joints, shimmered faintly beneath frost. She looked up. Her eyes were wide and dark and distant, but they found him, they saw him, and for a heartbeat he saw something back. Not alien, just someone about to die. He didn't think. He moved. Gideon knelt, reaching for her arm. She flinched. Not a full recoil, just a reflexive twitch. Her eyes didn't even narrow. There was no fight left. "I've got you," he muttered, voice rough from disuse. He slipped an arm under her shoulders and the other beneath her knees. She weighed nothing. She smelled like wind and blood and wet metal. He carried her inside. The door slammed behind him and the air changed. Warmth pressed in from the furnace vents, flooding the narrow corridor with a low hum. He laid her on the salvage mattress nearest the heat source and stripped her soaked coat. Her shirt clung to her skin, ice locked in the seams. His hands hesitated, then steadied. He used the blade of his multi-tool to cut clean through the fabric, careful not to touch bare skin unless he had to. She was shaking violently now, signs of thaw setting in. Dangerous, but not fatal. Not yet. He wrapped her in 3 layers, an old solar blanket, then fleece, then thermal fiber. He tucked her arms close to her chest. She didn't speak. Her lips moved, but no sound came. He bent closer. "Why?" she whispered. The word hit him like a memory he'd tried to bury. Why? Because he used to be the one who sent people like her away. He exhaled, sitting back on his heels. Because no one else did. She blinked once, then again. Her eyes closed. He sat there long after her breathing had steadied. The heating coil ticked behind them, expanding. Outside, the city kept howling, but inside this rusted, forgotten room, under a roof barely held together with bolts and regret, something had changed. For the first time in a long time, Gideon Strake hadn't said no. He had opened the door. And the question now, as he watched her sleep, was what it would cost him to keep it open. The warmth hurt. Sierra wasn't prepared for that. It came not like a gift, but like a punishment, flooding into limbs that had grown used to painlessness. The fire in her muscles felt cruel. Her spine ached from the slow thaw. Her stomach cramped as blood returned to her core. She gasped and clutched the blanket tighter around her body. Her body. She took inventory, instinctively, as she always did upon waking somewhere new. Still dressed, though her outer layer was missing. Underneath the thermal wrap, her tunic clung to her skin, dry now but stiff. A thick jacket had been placed beneath her head, cradling her neck. Her boots had been removed. Her feet were wrapped in warm cloth. She wasn't shackled. She wasn't dead. Her eyes opened slowly. The room was dim but functional. Pipes lined the ceiling, insulated in salvaged foam. Every inch of the space had a purpose. A wall of storage crates repurposed into a pantry. A workbench littered with circuit boards and copper coils. A sleeping mat pressed against a furnace vent that glowed with a steady orange pulse. This wasn't wealth, it was survival. And then she saw him. He sat at the edge of the room, facing the wall, but turned just enough to watch her in the reflection of a bent metal panel. His profile was sharp, shadowed by stubble. Black hair, military short, jaw tight, alert but not aggressive. She didn't speak. Neither did he. Sierra sat up slowly, every muscle protesting. Her legs trembled beneath the blanket. He didn't move to stop her. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice a dry whisper. He turned. His expression was calm, unreadable. "Here," he said simply. "Safe enough for now." She held his gaze, unsure if she believed him. The last place she'd been told was safe had tried to register her as cargo. "I'm Gideon Strake," he added. She said nothing. He rose and moved to the stove without fanfare. A blackened pot sat atop the rigged burner, releasing faint trails of steam into the chilled air. The scent was foreign but comforting, something root-based, salted, thick. He ladled the broth into a ceramic bowl, approached her and placed it on the crate beside her bedding, then stepped back. No orders, no pressure, just silence and space. She eyed the bowl, her stomach twisted. It could be drugged. It could be anything. But the hunger was real, sharp as a blade now that her body remembered what warmth felt like. Her hand shook as she picked it up. The heat made her hiss, but she didn't drop it. She drank in small, halting gulps. The first swallow burned. The second made her cough. By the third, her hands had steadied. He said nothing, just watched her until she was finished. She set the bowl down, breath shaky. "You found me. You knocked," he said. "I don't remember. You were almost unconscious. If you'd collapsed a few minutes earlier," his voice didn't trail off like a threat. It ended like a record of fact, a line on a report. She curled her feet under the blanket and looked down at her hands. The blue of her skin had darkened in the cold. Now it flushed with deep violet, pulsing where circulation returned. No restraints, no commands, no questions about species or origin. Still, she couldn't help it. "Why did you open the door?" He stood quietly for a long time. Then he sat across from her, cross-legged, near the heat. His posture not relaxed, but far from hostile. "I wasn't going to," he said. She looked at him again, this time more closely. His face was young but tired. Not the kind of tired that came from lost sleep, the kind that soaked into the bones, regret maybe, or something worse. "I used to work for the directorate," he said. "Civil processing. I reviewed asylum requests, checked files, signed denials." He paused, as if waiting for her to react. She didn't move. Her fingers had curled into the fabric of the blanket, but she said nothing. "I saw people like you every day," he continued. "Not in person, on screens, in data cells. You weren't even called people. Just species codes, biologics, non-priority clearance." He didn't sound proud. He didn't sound defensive. "One family," he said, his voice a shade quieter, "was flagged for immediate removal. I approved it. They were caught outside Dome 11 a week later. The guards wouldn't let them back in. They froze." Silence filled the room like mist, thick, suffocating. "After that," he added, "I burned my identity chip." Walked away. He didn't look at her. "I thought disappearing would be enough. It wasn't." She hadn't realized she was holding her breath. She let it out slowly. His words didn't make sense to her, or maybe they made too much. "You helped make this world," she said, voice even. "I helped keep it this way," he corrected. "Now what?" she asked. He met her eyes. "You stay here," he said. "Rest, heal, then decide." "I'm not staying." "I didn't ask you to." They stared at each other across the flickering light. Something passed between them then, an unspoken understanding that neither of them could name. Not trust, not yet, but not hostility either. Something quieter, shared exile. She shifted, drawing the blanket tighter. The warmth was starting to feel real now, less like a trick. He stood, walked to the corner and returned with her coat, now dry, neatly folded. He set it down within arm's reach. Then he added, "If you plan to go, wait a day. Storm's coming." She didn't respond. He turned to leave, but at the doorway he paused. "The door doesn't lock," he said over his shoulder. "Come and go as you like." She looked down at the bowl in her lap. No cage, no chains. And yet, she didn't move. When she finally lay back down, the blanket felt heavier. The heat no longer startled her. It soaked in slow and deep. She listened for footsteps. There were none. Her eyes closed. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't need to pretend she was already gone. The next morning came slowly. No sun rose over Sector 9K. Light seeped through cracks in the ceiling, pale and sickly blue from the sky filters far above. The furnace had dimmed to an ember glow, low enough to preserve fuel, warm enough to keep frost from creeping in. The air still carried the faint sting of metal and cold concrete, but the space held its warmth like a held breath. Sierra woke without jerking for the first time in weeks. No alarms, no doors slamming open, no boots scraping asphalt, just the distant hiss of heating coils and the sound of someone moving carefully across the room. She didn't sit up. She kept her eyes closed, listening. A drawer slid open. Tools clinked softly. Gideon was working, not far, 10, maybe 12 paces from where she lay. She heard the rhythmic click of a voltage tester, the hiss of a solder tip against a fresh wire. Not surveillance, not interrogation, just maintenance. Eventually she stirred, stretching slowly under the blanket, her limbs stiff but no longer numb. Her joints ached with something ordinary now, not the gnawing pain of cold, but the dull stiffness of recovery. Gideon glanced over but said nothing. His attention returned to the wiring module he was hunched over, some kind of junction converter stripped down to its raw circuit board. She sat up and let the blanket fall from her shoulders. Her tunic clung to her arms, slightly wrinkled from sleep but dry. She reached for the jacket he'd left the night before, slipped it over her shoulders, and instinctively checked the seams. No tampering, no missing pieces, just clean and warm. "I adjusted the cuffs," he said without looking up. "They were stiff from ice." Her fingers paused on the sleeves. "Thank you," she said. Gideon shrugged, still working. She stood slowly, balancing herself. Her legs felt unsteady but functional. It had been days since she'd stood without bracing against a wall. She crossed the room, passing the furnace, and stopped beside a small jug of water left on a metal shelf. She looked at him. "Boiled," he said. She drank. The metal cup was cold, but the water went down smooth. It settled in her stomach with a weight that made her briefly dizzy. Then hunger followed. He noticed. "There's more soup," he said. She nodded. He ladled a portion from the same pot as before, still simmering on the low flame. The smell was stronger this time, not rich, but fragrant in a way that suggested effort. A single clove of something sharp and spicy floated near the edge. She sat cross-legged on the floor, knees tucked in, and took the bowl with careful hands. He joined her without ceremony, sitting across from her and resting his elbows on his thighs. They ate in silence. It wasn't companionable, not yet. But it wasn't tense either. It was the silence of two people whose survival didn't require words. Two beings from different species who had, for the moment, accepted the simple truth. They were alive, indoors, warm. Sierra's spoon scraped the bottom of the bowl. She hesitated, then asked, "You live alone?" Gideon nodded. "Too many people draw attention. Noise, heat signatures, smell." She studied him. "You don't look like a man who's hiding." "I'm not," he said. "I'm waiting to stop being hunted." There was a beat of silence before he added, "They don't care who I was anymore. They care that I vanished." "You could have joined the towers," she said. "Your kind always gets out." "I chose the wrong side too late," he replied. "And I didn't want out. I wanted away." Sierra tilted her head slightly. "Is there a difference?" He looked at her then, really looked, and for a flicker of a second, something passed behind his eyes. Not pity. Recognition. "Yeah," he said. "There is." She didn't push further. Instead, she stood and walked to the far wall, where a narrow vent hummed faintly behind old mesh. The warmth of the furnace was beginning to dissipate into the outer rooms, where the heat mattered more. "You've reinforced the airlocks," she said, tracing one of the seals with her fingers. "Partially. Enough to keep the cold out and scanners confused. Still need to finish the west side." "You're not from here," she said. "Not originally." "No one's from here anymore," Gideon replied. She turned, arms folded loosely over her chest. Her voice was quiet, cautious. "I was told not to come to 9K. "I'm surprised they told you anything," he said. She gave a brief, dry breath, almost a laugh. "They said only criminals and ghosts lived down here." They were half right. A silence settled again. Then he asked, "Why did you come here, Sierra?" Her name in his mouth caught her off guard. Not because of how he said it, but because he'd remembered it. No one ever did. Usually they didn't ask, and if they did, it wasn't out of care. She hesitated. "Because I ran out of other places," she said finally. He nodded. That made sense to him. She moved back toward the center of the room, eyeing the wall-mounted scanner system he'd partially dismantled. "You've been here long?" "3 winters. I don't count anymore." "What did you do before?" He didn't answer. She didn't finish the question. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. Not empty. Weighted. She sat down again, closer to the furnace now. When she spoke next, her voice was quieter. "Where I come from, people don't survive alone." Gideon looked up. "Here, they don't either," he said. They watched each other for a long moment, and then Sierra leaned back against the wall, drawing her legs up to her chest. She closed her eyes. Not tightly, not defensively, just resting. Gideon rose, walked toward a crate, and pulled out a small, flat device. He hesitated, then offered it to her. She opened her eyes. "What is it?" "Hand warmer," he said. "Thermal battery inside, only lasts an hour, but it helps." She took it. Their hands brushed briefly. She didn't flinch this time. He returned to his workbench. And for the first time since arriving, Sierra stopped listening for footsteps behind the walls. She stopped counting how long it would take to run if he turned on her. Instead, she held the warmth in her hands, closed her eyes again, and let her body relax, if only slightly. She didn't sleep. But she didn't stand watch either. That was something. And Gideon across the room said nothing, but the small shift in his shoulders told another story. Maybe neither of them was alone anymore. Not exactly. The heater kicked on with a soft clunk, sending a wave of warmth through the floorboards as the air system cycled its low hum. Sierra sat at the far end of the room, her legs folded beneath her, hunched over a patch of fabric she was carefully restitching. The thread, salvaged from one of Gideon's toolkits, was the wrong color, gray against the soft navy of her sleeve. but she worked with a steady patience that suggested it mattered more than aesthetics. Gideon was at the table, examining the cracked shell of a perimeter sensor. His hands moved efficiently, but his focus drifted, eyes flicking to her every few minutes like he was waiting for something. She finally spoke without looking up. "You said you were part of the directorate, civil processing." He nodded, though she wasn't watching. "I was." "Did they train you to look at people and not see them?" Her voice wasn't accusing, not angry, just quiet, curious. He set the sensor down. The metal ticked softly as it cooled. "Number. They trained us to see patterns, deviations, biologics, risk types. I got good at that." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "But no, they didn't have to train us not to see people. That part came easy." Sierra didn't reply. Gideon rubbed his thumb over a burn mark on the edge of the table. "When I started, I thought the system made sense. So many requests, not enough space. Prioritization protocols were necessary. I told myself it was objective. Rational." She tied off the last stitch, biting the thread clean with her teeth. "But it wasn't," he said. "It never was." He stood and moved toward the heating unit, adjusting one of the vents with a screwdriver. There was this girl, 12 maybe. Her file had a warning flag: non-human female, orphaned, no linguistic integration. They marked her for secondary review. That usually meant automatic denial. But there was a message embedded in the request, a note from a translator. Said the girl had memorized an entire phrasebook and was asking for shelter in 12 different languages. Sierra glanced up, eyes sharp. "I flagged it, sent it to an ethics officer for reevaluation." The file came back the next day with the translator's note removed. Stamped, "Rejected, no appeal." He stared at the vent, then at the wall beyond it. 2 weeks later, I saw her face on a clearance report. She died outside a freight depot on the outskirts of Ventral Ring. Hypothermia. She froze waiting in line. Sierra's hands stilled on the fabric in her lap. "That was the day I stopped processing," he said. "But not the day I stopped being guilty." The silence between them deepened. It wasn't awkward. It was honest. Finally, Sierra shifted, rising to her feet. She moved slowly. Her body was healing, but her posture still bore the stiffness of someone used to bracing for violence. She walked to the crate near the corner, picked up a cup, and poured herself water. "You wanted to stop being a part of it," she said. "But you didn't stop benefiting from it." He didn't argue. "I've watched humans steal from dying camps, strip weapons from corpses, smuggle food while infants starve beside them. I've watched mothers in line for shelter get branded with rejection codes before they even spoke." "I know." Sierra turned to face him, her voice calm. "And I've also seen one open a door when no one else did." Gideon didn't move. She set the cup down and leaned against the crate. "I was raised in the twilight zone of Calhoun, Outlands, agricultural buffer zone south of the Viora Range. My family grew temple reeds and heat moss for export. We weren't poor, but we weren't protected." She ran a thumb over the rim of the cup. "When the expansion zones started pushing closer to the border, humans came in with the excavation crews. One of them married a local girl. Her parents were executed. The others, my people, went silent." Gideon's brow furrowed. "That wasn't in the reports." "No," she said flatly. "You wouldn't have read that part." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "My mother was a language keeper, one of the last from our line who remembered the pre-Exodus scripts. She taught me the core forms: gesture, tone, ancient cadence." "You speak differently," he said. Sierra gave a small smile. "My accent was burned out of me at age 15. They made me repeat Earth Standard until it didn't catch in my throat anymore." Gideon blinked slowly. "Who?" "Private recovery contractors. They call them education centers now. Back then they were just silos." The word fell like stone in the room. "I escaped with 3 others. One died on the ridge, one in the mines. The third, I don't know." Her voice quieted. "I came through tunnels and freight tracks. I stole oxygen credits. I rationed protein bars to last 20 days. I crossed 9 checkpoints using 6 different names." She looked at him then. Truly looked, her expression unreadable. "And then I knocked on your door." He met her gaze. There was no pride in his face, no guilt either, just the honest weight of understanding. "You shouldn't have had to," he said. "No one should." She walked toward the heater and sat down beside it, her back to the metal wall. The silence between them shifted again, heavier, but also cleaner. They weren't strangers anymore. not just shelter and survivor. Do you believe in redemption? She asked. I believe in action, he said. Words don't erase anything. Good, she said, closing her eyes. Then maybe we have something in common. He nodded once, almost to himself. The furnace ticked. Outside, wind scraped softly against the paneling. Inside, two people from opposing sides of a ruined system sat breathing the same air, carrying the same ghosts. Neither of them spoke again that night. They didn't have to. For the first time, they understood each other, not as species, not as strangers, but as survivors of the same machinery. And that was enough, for now. The first real storm of the cycle arrived just before dusk. It didn't roar. It pressed, heavy and quiet like a lid sealing over the world. Cold thickened in the walls, crept down through rusted vents, and curled along the floor like smoke. Outside, the wind turned directionless, no longer cutting but constant, humming through the skeleton of Sector 9K with the patience of something ancient and cruel. Inside the shelter, the heat grid sputtered once, then caught again with a low vibration. Sierra crouched beside the furnace with her hands outstretched, palms hovering inches from the vent. Her sleeves were rolled up. Scars traced the backs of her forearms. Thin lines, faded, but visible in the right light. Gideon noticed them. He didn't ask. She didn't offer. He was across the room, crouched low, tightening the mount on a thermal pipe that had started to groan under pressure. His knuckles were scraped from earlier. He'd cracked them on the wall panel when it slipped during reinforcement. A single drop of dried blood curved along the line of his thumb. Sierra spoke first. You're bleeding. It's nothing, he muttered. Still, she said. You should clean it. He didn't argue. He stood and walked toward the wash basin near the rear corridor. She followed him quietly, like the words had broken some invisible wall they hadn't realized was there. He rinsed his hands, jaw tight. The cut stung. She reached past him for a scrap of sterilized cloth, gently took his hand, and wrapped the wound. Her fingers were deft, impersonal, but they lingered a second too long. He looked at her. Her face was calm, unreadable, but her eyes held something new. Not warmth, not yet, but something close. A quiet gravity that said she wasn't indifferent anymore. She released his hand and stepped back. I'm not fragile, he said softly. I know, she replied, but you're not invincible either. Neither of them smiled. The words weren't playful, just true. Later, while he was checking the outer seals, Sierra walked the perimeter of the main room and began to rearrange supplies. Not aggressively, deliberately. She moved ration packs into more efficient stacks. She found a loose water cartridge half frozen near the back wall and placed it near the furnace to thaw. Gideon noticed. He didn't comment, but when he passed her on the way to the tool cabinet, he stopped. You've done this before. Her hands stilled. Not in a place this safe. He studied her for a moment. Tell me, he said, voice low. She turned to face him fully. 3 years ago, I lived in a skyport drainage corridor with 19 others. They rotated leadership every third day to keep order. We rationed one meal across 6 mouths. We insulated vents with body wraps. People left when they got sick. We stopped asking where they went. Her tone didn't rise. She didn't embellish or soften it. There was a boy, human, younger than you. He gave me half his coat once. I didn't even ask. Gideon nodded slowly. Did he make it out? No, she said. He caught a lung mold that winter. His chest filled with liquid before anyone could trade for antibiotics. I held his hand the night he stopped breathing. There was a silence that followed, dense and absolute. Then she added, that was the last time I let myself owe anyone anything. The words hung between them like frost. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't reach for her hand. Instead, he stepped aside and said, come with me. She followed him down a narrow corridor, past the secondary heat reservoir and the spare generator coils. He stopped at a wall panel that didn't look any different from the others until he pressed 2 points at once. The surface hissed, then slid back with a click. Behind it was a tunnel, narrow, reinforced with scavenged plating, lined with conduit tubing and an old track light system that barely worked. The walls curved downward, deeper underground. Sierra turned to him, one brow raised. This is a drop route, he said. It runs beneath the street grid, connects to 4 escape hatches across 3 sectors. Her breath caught. How long have you been building this? Since the second winter, he said. I wasn't sure why at first. And now? He looked at her. Now I think it's for people like you. She stared at the tunnel. Her body shifted, barely. But Gideon saw it, a flinch beneath her calm, a need carefully masked by years of caution. "You're planning something," she said. "Yes." "You want help?" "Yes." She exhaled. It wasn't a sigh, more like a controlled release, a deliberate loosening of something tightly held. "Then we should begin with the wiring," she said. "This tunnel won't stay hidden long with exposed current lines." He gave a slight smile. "You know routing?" "I was raised by engineers," she replied. They worked in silence. Later that night, when the tunnel was dark again and the hatch sealed shut, they returned to the main room. The air was heavy with the scent of hot wiring and thawed ration stew. The storm outside still pressed at the walls, endless and low. Gideon stirred the pot. Sira sat near the furnace, fingers laced loosely in her lap. He served 2 bowls, handed one to her. She accepted it without hesitation this time. As they ate, neither spoke, but their breathing matched. And in that small space, beneath a ruined city and the weight of 2 broken pasts, something living took root. Not trust. Not yet. But something warmer than silence. Snow slid in whispering sheets across the upper grid. It no longer howled or bit. It pressed, steady and heavy, like the world had forgotten how to move forward. Sector 9K, buried beneath layers of abandoned infrastructure, had gone completely still. Gideon stood just outside the reinforced hatch, collar high, eyes scanning the skeletal remains of the megastructures above. Gray pillars rose like broken ribs into a sky smothered by ice fog. Nothing moved out there. Nothing dared. He wasn't watching for threats, not exactly. He was waiting. Below, Sira worked in the heart of the shelter, bent over an open relay casing. Her sleeves were pushed up, and the low furnace light turned the lines of her forearms, those pale, violet-blue curves, into fluid shadows. She soldered a replacement node into the board with focused ease, her breath visible in the cold space, her brow furrowed with quiet determination. She'd barely spoken all morning. They'd worked side by side for 3 days now, repairing the signal tunnel, scavenging from the eastern grid, plotting a network of escape paths for the displaced. But the rhythm they'd fallen into wasn't just tactical anymore. It was personal, lived in. Gideon came back inside, stamping frost from his boots, watching as she finished her work. "I tightened the beacon loop," she said before he could speak. "The signal's stable, massed through the drainage band, just like you planned." He nodded. "We'll try broadcasting tomorrow." Sira clicked off the soldering tool and sat back. Her shoulders ached. She'd slept barely 4 hours the night before. Not because she wasn't tired, but because stillness had begun to feel more dangerous than movement. The quiet in her body left too much room for memory. Gideon moved toward the heating unit, checking fuel levels, twisting the valve slightly. "You always do that," she said. He glanced back. "What?" "Move. Fix something. Find something to do. Bad habit." "Or maybe," she added, "you're afraid of what happens when things finally work." He didn't respond at first. Then, "Maybe." Silence settled between them like fog, thick, cold, but not empty. Sira stood slowly, stretching the stiffness from her arms. She crossed to the supply rack, pulling down a thermoplastic container and setting it beside the furnace. When she opened it, steam rose off the food they'd thawed hours ago. She served him a portion without asking, then herself. They ate sitting across from each other, legs folded, heads bowed slightly. The kind of quiet that made you feel every motion. After a few minutes, Sira asked, "Do you ever think about what this place could have been?" He glanced up. "This city," she clarified, "before it was left behind, before the towers went up." "I used to," he said, "before I learned who they left down here. And now? Now I think about how much we can build with what they didn't take." She studied his face. "You're still rebuilding yourself too." He met her eyes. "So are you." She looked away, not in shame, but in agreement. "I never imagined I'd care what happened to anyone again." Gideon tilted his head. "Do you?" The question sat for a long moment between them. Then she said simply, "Yes." He nodded, setting his bowl aside. "So do I." Sira leaned forward, resting her arms on her knees. Her voice dropped, quieter now. "There was a time I couldn't be touched, not even by people I trusted. I flinched. Every time, my body forgot how to want warmth." Gideon didn't interrupt. "When you carried me that first night, I wasn't unconscious. Not fully. I felt your arms. I felt the heat when you pulled the blankets around me. and I waited for the price. A breath passed. But it never came, she whispered. I wasn't owed anything, he said. I know. But I was used to men who took what they thought they were owed anyway. Her voice didn't crack. It didn't need to. The restraint in it was more powerful than collapse. She lifted her gaze to meet his. Her expression was unreadable, but not cold. I've wanted to ask something for days now, she said. Ask. She hesitated. Why didn't you ask me to stay? I didn't want to make it harder for you to leave, he said. But I haven't left. No, he agreed. You haven't. Sira shifted forward, closing the space between them. She reached out and touched his hand, fingers brushing across the scar near his thumb, the same one she'd cleaned 2 nights ago. He stilled beneath her touch, not tense, not eager, just open. If I stay tonight, she said quietly, it's not because I'm cold. His voice was low. And if I hold you, it won't be to keep you warm. She leaned in. Their kiss wasn't sudden or fiery or desperate. It was slow, curious, the kind that starts because you need to know, not what someone tastes like, but what they carry. It wasn't about mouths or breath. It was about relief. Their foreheads touched when they pulled back, eyes still closed. Sira whispered, I don't know how to do this right. There's no right, he murmured. Then what if I ruin it? Then we start again. They undressed slowly, carefully, not out of hesitation, but reverence. Her skin was marbled with old frostburn, bruises, and something deeper than scars. His body bore the marks of years underground, burn tracks, muscle tension from years of crouching in 2 small rooms. But when they lay down, it wasn't to lose themselves. It was to be found. No gasps, no promises. Just breath and skin, and the quiet understanding that neither of them had to survive alone anymore. Later, Sira lay with her cheek against his chest, listening to the soft tick of the furnace and the steadiness of his pulse. Gideon's arm curled loosely around her, protective but not possessive. His other hand traced small circles against the side of her waist. Tomorrow, she said, eyes half-lidded. We broadcast. He nodded, pressing a kiss to her temple. And we leave the door unlocked. She let her eyes close, letting herself feel something she hadn't allowed in years. Safety. Not the kind forged by walls and weapons, the kind built from trust. The door opened before sunrise, not by accident and not because someone knocked. This time Gideon opened it himself, slowly, deliberately, letting the breath of the frozen city rush in and mix with the warmth they'd built inside. He stood there for a long moment, eyes scanning the skeletal skyline. The towers above flickered faintly, distant glimmers of a world that had left this sector behind. Snow swirled around his boots, and his coat shifted in the wind, but he didn't move. Behind him, Sira stirred awake on the pallet near the furnace. Her body curled instinctively toward the heat, but when she didn't find him beside her, her eyes opened. She saw him standing in the doorway, silhouetted in the pale dawn light, barely more than a shape against the blue sky, outlined by the warmth behind him and the cold ahead. She rose and crossed the room barefoot. Her steps were silent on the concrete. You opened it early, she said. It was time. They stood there together, shoulder to shoulder, hands brushing, breath visible in the morning chill. Then, movement. A figure emerged from the misted street, small and bent beneath layers of fabric. The first shape was barely more than a shadow at first, but it limped with purpose. A sled dragged behind it, makeshift, crude, but functional. When the figure collapsed just meters from the door, Gideon stepped forward. The person, no older than 20, looked up with violet-streaked eyes and cracked lips. Her voice rasped in a dialect Gideon didn't understand, but Sira did. The girl whispered a single word. Home? Sira dropped to her knees and wrapped her in a thermal blanket. Yes, she answered. You made it. Valenya, the first, had survived 3 weeks alone after fleeing a failed relocation camp. Her file had labeled her as biogenetic hybrid, non-conforming, flagged for sterilization and behavioral realignment. But she had outlasted her escort unit. She had dragged herself across frozen sewer grids, whispering that she heard a signal, a kind voice that didn't sound like an order. By midday, 2 more came. A pair, man and woman, both tall, both exhausted beyond words. Their arms were looped around one another, walking not as companions, but as if each was the only thing holding the other upright. Bren and Kor. Their faces were smeared with ash and grit from mining camps deep in the East Territories, where human-owned companies still ran illegal extraction colonies under the Directorate's blind eye. They'd escaped after a botched rebellion. Core's legs shattered in a tunnel collapse, Bren missing 3 fingers from a punishment detail. Sierra reached for Core first, then held Bren's hand when he refused to let go. "We don't need names," she said softly, "but you'll need rest." That night, as the new arrivals drifted into uneasy sleep, the furnace room filled with a different kind of silence. Not hollow, not afraid, just full. And then the knock came again. This one was harder, slower, older. Gideon opened the door and froze. The man standing outside had a limp. His coat was ancient Directorate surplus, patched, faded, and bearing a crest no one wore anymore. He looked up and recognition flickered in his eyes. Not just at the shelter or the warmth or Sierra's silhouette behind Gideon, but at Gideon himself. "I know you," the man said. His voice was rough, wind-worn. "You used to sit behind a desk with a seal in your hand. You stamped my denial 7 winters ago." Gideon didn't speak, didn't blink. Sierra stepped forward, unsure, tense. The man took another step closer. "I begged," he said. "I had a daughter. I begged for her, and you said, regrettably non-qualifying." Gideon's hand curled around the frame of the door. "I remember," he said. His voice cracked with it. "Her name was Meryl," the man added, softer now. "She died 3 days after you closed the case." Silence swallowed the room. "I'm sorry," Gideon said. "I've said it 1,000 times to the air. I didn't know anyone was still alive to hear it." The man looked past him, to the furnace glow behind, to the sound of shallow breathing, the smell of broth and melted ice. "You left the door open," he said. "I did." The man nodded once. "Then let me die inside it." "No," Gideon answered. He stepped aside. "You can live here instead." Tavik Ren entered without another word. By morning, the shelter held 9. Sierra found herself wrapping another blanket around a small boy, half asleep, ribs showing through his shirt. His mother, silent, stared past her, unmoving. She hadn't spoken a word since arriving. Not once. But when Sierra touched her shoulder gently and offered her a cup of heated water, the woman's hands didn't tremble. Not even a little. Sala. Her name came from her son, who whispered it while she slept. She had once worked as a translator for the Unity Council before leaking classified memos that proved the Directorate was falsifying deportation data. They silenced her with exile. She silenced herself with grief. And now, here she was, wrapped in quiet, holding her child, alive. By the 3rd day, the small map on the wall was updated. Gideon marked off 2 new access hatches. Sierra added 2 water caches and reconfigured the emergency beacon frequency. They weren't just offering shelter now. They were mapping routes. They were building a way through. That evening, Gideon sat on the ledge of the secondary corridor with his boots half unlaced, staring at a sketch Sierra had made on the back of a plastic panel. Routes, symbols, names. He didn't notice her approach until she sat beside him. "You haven't spoken much," she said. He looked down at the drawing. "I don't know how to say what this feels like." Sierra leaned her head on his shoulder. "You don't have to," she said. "We're living it." He nodded. "I just keep waiting for it to fall apart." She took his hand. "Then we rebuild it." A beat passed. "You're not the man who said no anymore," she added quietly. "And who am I now?" She turned, her eyes meeting his. "You're the one who opened the 18th door." They kissed. No hesitation, no fear, just truth. And behind them, beyond the walls, the world remained cold, cruel, and broken. But here, in this stolen corner of firelight and faith, a new system had begun to hum. A system built not on classification or clearance levels or sterilized protocols, but on a single rule. If you knock, we open. And this time, the door stays open. Forever. 5 years later, the door was still open. Its frame had been reinforced 3 winters ago with salvaged polyalloy and magnetic flux anchors, strong enough to hold even under structural strain. The corridor beyond had changed too, no longer damp and makeshift. It was lined now with hand-marked arrows, bioluminescent markers, and a small mural of colored tiles pieced together by dozens of patient hands. They called the place the 18th now, not a shelter, not a base, a beginning. Sierra stood at the mouth of the tunnel, one hand braced gently against the curve of her stomach, the other pressed to the concrete wall where condensation collected in tiny beads. The baby shifted inside her, slow and strong. She smiled faintly at the movement, then glanced back into the wide, gently humming interior of the main chamber. Voices rose in the distance, soft, busy, full of life. Children arguing over tool parts, someone singing off-key while repairing a solar panel array, a kettle boiling in one of the western alcoves, and above it all, footsteps. She didn't have to turn to know who they belonged to. Gideon's stride had a rhythm she could feel in her bones now. Not because it was heavy, but because it was steady. The man who used to avoid standing still had grown into someone whose footsteps were worth following. He came up beside her, setting a worn pack down and pulling off his gloves. His face was older, not with age but with hours lived, long nights, impossible choices, and 1,000 small acts of kindness he never once claimed credit for. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." They both looked toward the tunnel mouth. Outside, the city shimmered in frost, lit from below by rising streetlight arrays they'd installed last spring. The sky was pink with sunrise, reflecting in broken windows that hadn't seen light in decades. "You feel it?" Sierra asked softly, her hand pressing lightly where the baby had just kicked. Gideon stepped behind her and wrapped both arms around her middle, palms spread over hers, fingers interlacing just above the gentle swell of her belly. "I feel you," he murmured, "both of you." They stood that way for a moment, breathing the quiet in, the kind of silence that didn't threaten, the kind that grew out of peace, not fear. "I had a dream last night," she whispered. "I was walking through the desert, alone. And when I looked back, there were footprints following me, tiny ones." Gideon pressed a kiss to her temple. "This child will never walk alone." Sierra closed her eyes briefly. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't opened the door that night?" "Every day. And I don't regret anything before you. I just don't believe in letting it be the end of the story." A soft beeping drew their attention. From a side panel by the door, the old frequency scanner still hummed, repurposed from a defunct surveillance post. Now it caught signals from distant allies, scattered shelters, encrypted rescue codes. A blue light pulsed. Someone was sending a response ping. Gideon leaned forward, read the waveform, and nodded. "Group of 3, 1 child, coming from the East Freight Line, ETA 4 hours. Do we have enough space?" "We always do." Sierra smiled, and her fingers tightened briefly on his. "Then let's get ready." They walked together down the main hall, past the mural of handprints, past the list of names etched into the wall, those who'd passed through, those who'd stayed, those they'd lost. The mural now stretched across 3 walls. It told a story of firelight, broken systems, and doors left open. And above it, someone, no one admitted to who, had etched a phrase into the ferro steel just last month. This place was not built for war. It was built for the survivors of silence and their children. Sierra paused beneath it, her hand still cradling her belly. She whispered more to herself than to him, "This child will be born in a place where no one says you don't belong." Gideon turned to her, took her face gently in both hands, and kissed her, slow, firm, without need or apology. "I know," he said, "because you made it that place." "No," she corrected him, resting her forehead to his. "We did." The generator hummed to life. Somewhere behind them, a group of children started reciting codes from the emergency drills, laughing between numbers. And outside, across the icy concrete of Sector 9K, a new group walked through the frost toward a light that stayed lit and a door that never closed. The door stayed open because someone, 2 someones, refused to let the world end in silence. And somewhere deep inside, a child stirred again. Alive, warm, and already waiting to be loved.